Hello, 5th and 6th grade. We are moving on to 10.2 in social studies today. We're starting to see some unrest between the North and the South. The South has just left the Union, created their own country called the Confederate States of the United States, and they have Jefferson Davis as their president. Lincoln as president now, this is not what he wanted. He wanted to keep the Union together, and he came to realize that war was the only thing that was going to bring the states back together into a unified country. So we are on page 175 in your social studies book, 10.2, the Civil War begins. Now, Civil War always means a war within its own country. So you have countrymen fighting against themselves. So members of the United States fighting against members of the United States instead of another country coming in, invading, and then causing war. Civil War means a war within your own country. The first battle. The United States Army had several forts within the Confederate territory. When the Confederate States demanded that these forts and their guns be surrendered to the Confederate States, the Union refused. By April 1861, only two significant forts had not fallen into the Confederate hands: Fort Pickens at Pensacola, Florida, and Fort Sumter in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. The war began when Confederate forces fired at Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861. The Union troops inside the Fort Sumter had few supplies and were forced to surrender after 2 days of fighting. A Confederate flag soon flew over the fort. The Confederates had won the first battle of the war. Little did they realize that a long, horrible fight lay before them. They mistakenly believed that the North would give up. They also thought that England and France would come to help them. But the Confederates were wrong. Call for soldiers. The Battle of Fort Sumter saddened President Lincoln, for he knew that the Union must be preserved at all costs. When he called for soldiers to defend the Union, thousands volunteered. Black statesman Frederick Douglass, an outspoken and active opponent to slavery, helped Lincoln recruit blacks. The Union soldiers, sometimes called Yankees, wore blue uniforms and marched beneath the stars and stripes. The Confederate Army wore gray and proudly waved their own Confederate battle flag. Some states in the South had not yet joined the Confederacy. When President Lincoln called for soldiers, however, they could not bear the thought of fighting against their own Southern neighbors. Instead, they left the Union and joined the Confederate States. These states were Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas. The Confederate government now consisted of 11 states. 22 states stayed with the Union. A blockade against the South. Because the North had many factories and many small farms which grew large supplies of food, it had sufficient food and supplies to last through the war. The South had few factories, however, and it had depended mainly on cotton and tobacco for its economy. The people could not eat tobacco, nor could they wear cotton unless it was turned into cloth by the factories in the North or in Europe. President Lincoln knew that the South depended on trade with Europe to supply her with guns, ammunition, war supplies, and even some food. Without these things, the South did not have a chance of winning the war. To stop the South's trade with Europe, President Lincoln sent Union ships to block all major seaports to the South. A few ships managed to slip through the blockade, but most Southern ships were stopped. The Merrimack and the Monitor. The South badly needed to break through the blockade and obtain important supplies. Because the Confederate Navy had very few ships compared to the Northern Navy, they decided to develop at least one powerful ship. Thus, the Confederates raised a Merrimack, an old ship that the Union had sunk, and covered it with iron plates. Cannonballs and gun shells were simply bouncing off the side of its thick plates. They fitted guns to the sides of the ship and mounted a sharp piece of iron to the ship's bow. With this iron ram, the Merrimac could crash into the sides of Union ships. At this time, ships were made out of wood. It would be simple for an ironclad ship to destroy wooden ships without receiving any harm to itself. Within a short time, the Merrimac had destroyed two of the best ships in the Union Navy. The Union had built an ironclad ship, the Monitor. Soon, the Merrimac met the Monitor in battle. People have described the Merrimac as looking like an upside-down bathtub, while the Monitor had been described as looking like a cheese box on a raft. For hours, the two ships fought in vain. But because neither vessel could do more than dent the other, neither side won. Still, the battle did have an important result. It proved the value of ironclad ships to this navy. Gradually, the wooden ships of the world became outdated. In the future, ships would be built with iron and steel. The Emancipation Proclamation. The plight of the slaves concerned President Lincoln. If he set them free, what would happen to them after war? Very few of them had any education. How could they get jobs in order to buy homes and food and clothing? How could a nation already weak from war help them? But as the war dragged on, President Lincoln decided that he could weaken the South and shorten the war by setting the slaves free. Thus, he made the Emancipation Proclamation, an announcement on January 1st, 1863. All slaves would be considered free in any states that were fighting against the North. Although the Emancipation Proclamation declared the states or the slaves in the South free, it could not really free the slaves until the North won the war. And it did not free any slaves who were owned in states that were not fighting against the Union. After the war, Congress would make an amendment to the charge of the Constitution, the 13th Amendment, giving all slaves in the United States and her territories their freedom. But the Emancipation Proclamation did have two immediate results. For many people, it changed the reason for fighting the Civil War. Before, the Union Army was fighting to keep our country from dividing, and the Confederate Army was fighting for states' rights. Now the Union Army was also fighting to free the slaves. Before the proclamation, England had considered helping the South become a more separate country. England opposed slavery, however, and had no desire to help the Southern continue their slavery. Thus, the Emancipation Proclamation ended the chance of England helping the South. Heroes of the Civil War. Many brave men fought on both sides of the Civil War. These men endured great hardships, hunger, cold, sickness, pain, and sometimes death. But they kept on fighting to defend what they thought was right. One courageous Union soldier, a black American by the name of William Harvey Kearny, rescued the Stars and Stripes from a wounded colored sergeant or flag bearer in the heat of battle at Fort Wagner. Before fainting from the wounds he had received while recovering the flag, Kearny proclaimed, "The old flag never touched the ground." Soldiers on both sides wrote letters home to their wives, parents, or sweethearts, telling them that the times were hard, but they knew that God would help them. Great leaders also arose during this time. Nobly, General Ulysses S. Grant, the leader of the Union troops, General Robert E. Lee, head of the Confederate Army, and General Stonewall Jackson, General Lee's most valuable assistant. Ulysses S. Grant, the Union general. General Ulysses S. Grant, Lincoln's most valuable general, began his rise to prominence when he took control of Tennessee in 1862. With the support of a fleet of gunboats, Grant's army moved against Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in the interior of the state. Although Fort Henry fell quickly, the Confederate troops at Fort Donelson resisted the Union forces. Grant surrounded the fort, determined to take it out or starve the Confederates in the process. When they asked for terms of surrender, Grant sent his famous reply, "No terms except unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted." By February, 40,000 Confederate soldiers had surrendered, and 4 cannonballs had fallen into the Union's hands. The courageous Union general soon became known as Unconditional Surrender Grant. Not a bad nickname to have. Ulysses S. Grant's greatest victory came at the Battle of Vicksburg in 1863. For 6 weeks, Grant's troops besieged this city along the Mississippi River until the Confederates finally surrendered. After the fall in Vicksburg, Union forces quickly took control of the Mississippi, dividing the Confederate states in two. Grant's many victories did not go unnoticed in Washington. In 1864, President Lincoln made him the commander of all Union armies. Robert E. Lee, Confederate general. The thought of war greatly troubled Robert E. Lee because he loved the United States. Lee also loved his home state of Virginia, however. When Virginia left the Union, Lee felt it was his duty to follow his state. Robert E. Lee became the most amazing general in the Civil War. He is remembered today as a gentleman, a great military general, and a man who has always placed duty and responsibility above his personal feelings. "Duty is the sublimest word in our language," he said. "Do your duty in all things." Do your duty in all things. You cannot do more. You should never wish to do less. Whenever Robert E. Lee has a decision to make, he first asked himself, "What is my duty as a gentleman and a Christian?" Once he knew the answer, he went ahead and did the thing that was needed to be done. It's a good example for us of seeking the Lord for big decisions, or even little decisions. Stonewall Jackson, one of the greatest military heroes of the Civil War, and one of the greatest generals of all time, was Thomas Stonewall Jackson, who fought under Robert E. Lee. Jackson earned the nickname of Stonewall at the Battle of Bull Run, when he and his soldiers fought against overwhelming odds. Another Confederate general, seeing Jackson's great courage, shouted out to his own men, "There's Jackson standing like a stone wall. Let us determine to die here, and we will conquer." Stonewall Jackson had an outstanding Christian testimony that he shared with the men under him and around him. Church services were held in the camp whenever possible, and he handed out gospel tracts to his troops and encouraged them to pray and read their Bibles faithfully. Before the war, he taught Sunday school classes for black slaves, and during the war, he continued to send money for the support of all those of this class. Pretty amazing. Stonewall Jackson lost his life in the Civil War when, as he came riding into camp one evening, one of his men mistook him for an enemy and shot him. In a last attempt to save his life, doctors amputated Jackson's left arm. General Lee, who greatly valued Jackson as a general and a Christian companion, declared sadly, "He has lost his left arm, but I have lost my right arm." General Stonewall Jackson died a few days later. On his deathbed, he was offered brandy and water in an attempt to revive him, but he refused to drink, crying out, "It tastes like fire and cannot do me any good." News of Stonewall Jackson's death spread quickly to other parts of the world. The people of England called him a heaven-born general, and in Scotland, the train conductors opened their doors of the passenger cars to tell passengers that the great Confederate general had died. General Stonewall Jackson had gone down in history as a great general and a great Christian. So some questions to answer today in your packets. Identify. 1, the first battle of the Civil War. 2, identify the black statesmen who helped President Lincoln recruit blacks to fight against the Union. 3, identify President Lincoln's announcement that all slaves would be considered free in any states fighting against the North. Number 4, the leader of Union troops. Number 5, the leader of the Confederate troop. And then number 6, what can we learn from General Stonewall Jackson's Christian Christian testimony? So go ahead and answer those in your packet. If you have any questions, please let me know. And next time we're going to go on to 10.3, which is important Civil War battles. I'll see you then.